Dear friends, don't miss future updates. Hit the subscribe button and help us reach our next milestone together. My name doesn't matter as much as the story I'm about to tell you, so I'll just ask you to sit with me for a while, the way you might sit with an old friend on a porch in the last hour of daylight, when the sky turns that soft color that makes people finally say the things they've been carrying around for years. I've wanted to tell this story honestly for a long time, without dressing it up in shock or shrinking it down into an apology, because both of those distortions would betray what actually happened to me, and more importantly, what actually happened inside me. What I want to share is not a spectacle, not a costume reveal, not a before and after clip designed to make you gasp. It's the long, quiet, sometimes painful process of a person learning who he is, learning what he isn't, and learning that those two questions are not the same and don't have to be answered on anyone else's timetable. I'm going to talk about crossdressing, about identity, about the borrowed clothing that helped me understand something true, and about the family, friends, and mistakes that shaped me along the way. If any of this sounds familiar to you, I hope it makes you feel less alone. If none of it sounds familiar, I hope it makes you a little more patient with the people in your life who are still figuring themselves out, because I promise you, more of them are doing that than you realize. I grew up in a small town where the streetlights buzzed all night and the neighbors knew what car you drove before they knew your name. And in a place like that, being different is not a philosophical problem, it's a practical one. My father worked with his hands and expected his sons to work with theirs, and my mother, who I loved with a quiet ferocity I couldn't articulate then, tried to soften the corners of the house without ever contradicting him out loud. I had an older brother who understood the rules of boyhood the way some children understand music, effortlessly, and I watched him move through the world the way a smaller animal watches a bigger one, admiring and afraid. From very early on, I felt a kind of static between what I was told to be and what I was not, a loud disagreement, just a low hum that never quite went away, the sort of sound you only notice when everything else is quiet. I remember being maybe 6 or 7, standing in the hallway outside my mother's bedroom while she got ready for a wedding, and watching her clip on earrings with an expression of gentle concentration, and thinking, without any words for it, that I wanted to know what that felt like. Not the earrings exactly, but the ritual, the being inside of that moment, the calm attention she gave to her own reflection. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't know there was anything to tell. I just filed the feeling away like a smooth stone in a pocket, and kept walking. School made everything louder, because school is where you learn that other children have a very precise sense of who is allowed to do what, and they enforce it with a cruelty that adults conveniently forget once they've grown up. I learned to sit a certain way, to laugh at certain jokes, to pretend I didn't notice certain things, and this performance was so thorough and so early that I mistook it for my personality for a very long time. When I was around 10, I found myself alone in the house on a rainy afternoon, and I wandered into my mother's closet not with any grand plan, but with the aimless curiosity children have when they are unsupervised and the world feels temporarily paused. I remember the smell of her perfume on the fabrics, faint and warm, and I remember pulling a soft cardigan off a hanger and holding it against myself in the mirror, not putting it on, just holding it and feeling a strange, quiet click, like a puzzle piece I hadn't realized was missing had suddenly slid into place. Then, of course, came the second feeling, the one that always came right after, which was shame. Not because anyone had told me specifically that this was wrong, but because I had absorbed by osmosis 1,000 small signals that this was not something boys did, and if boys did it, they were laughed at, and being laughed at in my town was a kind of small social death. I put the cardigan back exactly the way I found it, smoothed it, closed the closet door, and told myself I would not think about it again. I thought about it constantly. Adolescence is a strange time for anyone, but for a person who is already carrying a secret they don't fully understand, it becomes a kind of pressure cooker. My body changed in ways I hadn't asked for and couldn't reverse, and the mirror stopped being a place of gentle curiosity and became a place of low-grade dread. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to imply that everyone who explores crossdressing feels this dread, or that this dread is the same as any single identity outcome. I only know what I felt, which was that the reflection in the mirror was starting to look like someone I hadn't agreed to become. I kept up appearances. I played on a team badly. I had friends, real ones, whom I loved and to whom I still lied by omission every single day. I got decent grades because grades were a place I could earn approval without having to reveal anything about my inner life. And in the quiet corners of that inner life, I began to experiment, cautiously and privately, with small things. A pair of my mother's stockings I found in a drawer of donations bound for the church, which I convinced myself she wouldn't miss. A scarf I bought at a thrift store 2 towns over with money I'd saved from mowing lawns, telling the cashier it was a gift for my sister, though I had no sister. I hid these things in a shoebox behind a loose panel in my closet, and every time I opened that box, I felt 2 feelings simultaneously: relief and terror, so tightly braided that I couldn't tell them apart. I want to pause here and say something honestly because I think it matters. In those years, I was not a bad person, but I was not always an honest one, and the dishonesty ate at me in ways I didn't have language for. Lying to my mother about the missing stockings, lying to the cashier about the imaginary sister, lying to my friends about why I sometimes seemed distracted or distant. All of these were small, and each one felt necessary at the time, but they added up into a low, chronic guilt that colored everything. I mention this because I want anyone listening who is in a similar place to know that the shame you feel is often not really about the clothing or the exploration. It's about the lying, and the lying is a symptom of a world that didn't yet give you a safe way to be honest. That doesn't excuse the lies, but it does explain them, and understanding that difference was, years later, one of the first things that let me begin to forgive the younger version of myself. High school ended, and I went away to a state university a few hours from home, which felt at the time like moving to another country. For the first time in my life, no one knew me. No one had a stored image of who I was supposed to be. I could be quiet in class and no one would say, "That's not like him." I could take a literature elective without my father raising an eyebrow at the dinner table. And most importantly, I had a dorm room with a door that locked, and I had a little more privacy than I'd ever had in my life. In that first year, I did something that, in retrospect, I think of as both brave and reckless, which is that I bought, with my own money, a single outfit that was unambiguously feminine. A simple dress, plain and modest, nothing dramatic, and a pair of flats. I remember the online order arriving in a plain cardboard box, and I remember sitting on my narrow dorm bed staring at that box for almost an hour before I opened it, because I understood in some wordless way that once I opened it, I could not unopen it. When I finally put the dress on alone, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, I did not feel euphoric. I want to be honest about that because a lot of stories about this moment are told as if the sky opened up. It didn't, not for me. What I felt was quieter and stranger, a sense of recognition, the way you might feel meeting a cousin you've heard about your whole life but never met, a sense of, oh, there you are. I stood in front of the small mirror on the back of the door, and I looked at myself for a long time, and I did not know yet what any of it meant, but I knew that pretending it meant nothing was no longer available to me. That year and the years right after were a slow and confusing exploration, and I want to describe them honestly rather than tidily. I did not immediately understand myself. I read too much online and drew conclusions too quickly, and then unlearned them. I confided in one friend, a woman in my program named Priya, whom I trusted because she had a way of listening that made you feel like she was not writing an internal report on you. I told her, haltingly, over the course of several late-night walks around campus, that I sometimes wore women's clothing when I was alone, and that I did not know what that meant about me, and that I was afraid of what it might mean, and equally afraid of what it might not mean. Priya did not try to solve me. She asked me questions, gentle ones, and she also, importantly, told me when I was being unfair to myself, which is a thing a good friend can do that a stranger on the internet cannot. She was the first person in my life who treated my inner conflict as a normal human thing to have, rather than a scandal or a diagnosis. And I think about that often because the way she responded to me shaped the way I have tried to respond to other people ever since. I don't want to skip past the harder middle of this story, though, because that would be dishonest, and the whole point of telling it is honesty. In my early 20s, I made mistakes. I was so used to hiding that I sometimes hid from people who had earned the right to know me, and I sometimes overshared with people who had not, because I was starving for one honest conversation, and I couldn't always tell the difference between an ally and an audience. I dated a woman named Elena for almost 2 years, and I did not tell her about this part of myself for most of that time, not because I was trying to trick her, but because I did not yet have the words, and because I was afraid that if I gave the words away, I would lose her. When I finally did tell her, one autumn night on the fire escape of her apartment, She cried, and I want you to understand that her tears were not the tears of a person who had discovered something monstrous. They were the tears of a person who had realized that the person she loved had been carrying something alone for a long time. She asked me why I hadn't trusted her sooner. I did not have a good answer. We tried to make the relationship work after that, and in the end we did not, but she remained a friend, and one of the things she said to me during our long conversation about ending things has stayed with me. She said, "You are allowed to figure yourself out, but you are not allowed to figure yourself out at the expense of the people who love you." That sentence knocked the wind out of me, because it named something I had been doing without admitting it. It was not enough to be honest about who I was becoming, I also had to be honest about the cost my process had for the people around me, and I had to take responsibility for that cost even while continuing the process. That responsibility became one of the guiding principles of the years that followed. Around this time, in my mid-20s, I began to see a therapist, which is a boring sentence to write but a life-altering thing to have done. I want to say a word about therapy because I think a lot of people expect it to be a place where a stranger tells you who you are, and it is not that at all, at least not with a good therapist. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Han, mostly asked me questions I had been avoiding asking myself, and she was patient in a way that felt almost radical after years of trying to hurry my way to a conclusion. Over many months, I began to sort out several threads that had been tangled together for most of my life. There was the thread of gender, which is what most people would assume this story is only about, but there was also the thread of shame, which had wrapped itself around every other thread, and the thread of family, and the thread of the small-town watchfulness I had internalized so completely that I still flinched at imagined stares even when I was alone in a room. Untangling these threads did not give me a single dramatic answer. It gave me something more useful, which was a set of smaller, truer answers I could actually live with. I learned that for me, crossdressing had not been one thing but several things at different times. Sometimes it had been a way of exploring a part of myself that had been forbidden, sometimes it had been a private comfort during periods of high stress, sometimes it had been a genuine expression of an identity that did not fit neatly into the categories I had grown up with, and sometimes I had to admit it had been a way of avoiding harder conversations about my life by pouring all my inner attention into one secret. All of those could be true at once, and none of them canceled the others out. Around the same time I was doing this inner work, my father got sick. I don't want to dwell on the medical details, because they're his and not mine to share, but I will say that watching a man like my father, who had built his entire self-image around physical capability and quiet stoicism, become dependent on others, changed something in me. I went home for long stretches to help my mother care for him, and I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, sitting with him in long silences that were not hostile, but simply were. One afternoon, near the end of a particularly hard week, he asked me, in a voice that was too tired for pretense, whether I was happy. I don't know if you have ever been asked that question by a parent who has never asked it before, but if you have, you know that it opens something in you that cannot easily be closed. I did not tell him everything that day. I don't believe you owe your parents every chapter of your inner life on their timetable, and he was too weak for a long confession that would have been more about my need than his. But I told him more than I ever had before. I told him that I had spent a lot of my life afraid of disappointing him, and that some of that fear had made me smaller than I needed to be. He listened. He did not say very much, because that was not his way, but he squeezed my hand once, briefly, and I understood that as an answer. He died a few months later. In the weeks after his funeral, I did something I had been putting off for years, which was to tell my mother about this part of myself, not as a dramatic revelation, but as one more piece of the larger project of no longer lying to the people I loved. I chose an ordinary afternoon, at her kitchen table, with a radio on low in the background, because I had decided that this news was not an earthquake and I did not want to present it as one. She was quiet for a long time. She asked me a few questions, some of them a little clumsy, some of them surprisingly precise. She said she had wondered sometimes over the years whether there was something I was not telling her, and she said she wished she had known how to ask. She did not perform acceptance, and she did not perform outrage. She just sat with it and with me, and eventually she got up and made tea, which was the way she had always handled anything too large for words. That tea, in a chipped mug I remembered from childhood, was one of the most important cups of anything I have ever had, because it was the moment I understood that my mother's love was not conditional on her fully understanding me, and that this was an enormous gift I had underestimated my whole life. I want to be careful not to make this story sound like it ended in a tidy triumph, because that would be a kind of lie, and lies are what this whole story has been trying to unlearn. There were still hard years after that. I lost a friendship with someone I had grown up with, a friend I had loved like a brother, because when I told him about my life, he could not find a way to reconcile it with the version of me he had built in his head, and after some painful conversations, we drifted apart. I mourned that friendship, and I still do sometimes, and I have tried not to be bitter about it, because bitterness is a heavy thing to carry, and I have carried enough heavy things. There were also job situations that required me to think carefully about what I disclosed and to whom, and I want to say honestly that not every workplace was safe, and part of growing up was learning to make strategic choices about my own visibility without treating those choices as moral failures. Being private in an unsafe environment is not the same as being ashamed, and it took me a long time to understand that distinction. Meanwhile, in my personal life, I continued the slow work of integrating the different parts of myself into a single, coherent person. I want to say something about what integration actually looked like, because I think the word gets used a lot without much specificity. For me, integration did not mean that I settled into one fixed presentation or one fixed label. It meant that I stopped treating one part of my life as a shameful secret hidden behind a false front. It meant that the same person who went to work in the morning was the same person who came home in the evening, and that the wardrobe in my closet, which by then included clothing of many kinds, was simply my wardrobe, not a battlefield. It meant that when I looked in the mirror, I was not surprised or ashamed by what I saw, whatever I happened to be wearing that day, and that when I introduced myself to new people, I did not feel that I was performing a role that a stranger might see through at any moment. Some days I dressed in ways that read as traditionally masculine, some days in ways that did not, and I stopped keeping score. I want to talk for a moment about the partner I eventually built a life with, whom I'll call M, because his story is his own, and I don't want to overshare on his behalf. M and I met at a community class we had both signed up for on a whim, and we became friends before we became anything else, which I now understand is one of the great blessings of my adult life. When our friendship began to shift towards something more, I told him early and clearly and without dramatics about who I was and how I lived, because I had learned by then that honesty at the beginning is a kindness even when it feels like a risk. M listened, asked thoughtful questions, and then, over time, made the decision that this life could be shared with me, not as a project he was undertaking but as a person he was choosing. Later, when we had been together for some time, M went through his own period of exploration, curious about what it might feel like to see himself in a different presentation, and I want to describe this gently because it was one of the most tender chapters of my life. He asked me one evening if I would help him try, not as a spectacle, not as a game, but as a private question he wanted to ask himself. I helped him the way Priya had helped me all those years earlier, without trying to answer his questions for him, without treating his curiosity as either alarming or trivial. We sat in our small apartment and he tried on a few things, and he looked at himself for a long time in the mirror, and afterward we talked quietly about what he had felt. It was not a transformation. It was a conversation, one of many, that he and I have had over the years about who we are and who we are becoming. He did not walk away from that evening with a new identity fixed in place. He walked away with more information about himself and more trust in me, and more trust in the idea that his own inner life was allowed to be explored in a safe place. Watching him give himself that permission was, for me, a kind of healing I had not known I still needed. It let me see from the outside what it had looked like when Priya once gave that same permission to me. I want to spend a little time here on some of the lessons I have taken away from all of this, because I do not want the story to be only a chronology of feelings. I want it to be useful. The first lesson is that identity exploration is not a performance you owe to an audience, and it is not a diagnosis you owe to a doctor, and it is not a confession you owe to a stranger on the internet. It is a private conversation you have with yourself, which you may at various points choose to share with people you trust. There is no correct pace for that conversation. Some people know who they are at 15. Some people are still learning at 50. Both of those trajectories are valid, and neither of them is more authentic than the other. The second lesson is that shame, if you let it, will hijack your entire inner life and convince you that the problem is you, when very often the problem is a set of rules you absorbed before you were old enough to consent to them. Naming those rules, saying them out loud to yourself, and asking whether you still agree with them is one of the most freeing things you can do. Not all of the rules will turn out to be wrong. Some of them will turn out to be worth keeping. But it should be your decision, made as an adult, and not a set of default settings you never questioned. The third lesson is that honesty is not the same as disclosure, and both of those matter, but they are not identical. You do not owe every person in your life every fact about your inner world. You do owe the people closest to you the truth about the things that materially affect them, and you owe yourself the ability to stop lying about who you are when you are alone in a room. There is a difference between privacy and secrecy, and learning that difference took me most of my 20s. Privacy is a right. Secrecy, in the way I had once practiced it, was a slow corrosion of my ability to be present with anyone, including myself. The fourth lesson, and maybe the most important one, is that other people's discomfort is often not about you at all. When someone in my life has struggled with what I have shared with them, I have tried, with varying degrees of success, to remember that their discomfort is usually a reflection of the story they were told about the world, and not a verdict on my worth. That does not mean I have to tolerate cruelty, and I don't. But it does mean that I try not to internalize every uncomfortable silence as evidence that I have done something wrong by existing. That distinction has saved my sanity more than once. The fifth lesson, which I only really learned in my 30s, is that responsibility does not disappear just because you are doing the hard work of understanding yourself. Elena was right all those years ago on the fire escape. You are allowed to figure yourself out. But you are not allowed to do it at the expense of the people who love you. In practice, that has meant apologizing when I needed to apologize, not defensively, but plainly. It has meant showing up for people even in the middle of my own hard chapters. It has meant recognizing that the story I am telling myself about my growth is not automatically the story other people are experiencing, and that their perspective is not an obstacle to my journey. It is a part of it. The sixth lesson, and this one I offer with some hesitation because it can be misused, is that resilience is a real thing, but it is not the same as suffering in silence. For a long time, I confused the two. I thought that because I had endured, I had grown, when in fact I had only accumulated more things to endure. Real resilience, I have come to believe, involves reaching out, letting yourself be helped, and admitting when you are struggling, not because you owe those things to anyone else, but because carrying everything alone is not a virtue, it is a slow injury. If you are listening to this, and you are carrying something alone, please consider that reaching out to one careful person or to a professional is not weakness, it is a form of respect for your own future. As I sit with all of this now, in a life that is quieter than the one I feared I might have, I find that I am not who I once thought I would be, and I am not who my father once expected me to be, but I am someone I recognize, and that recognition is a kind of quiet victory I did not know was possible. I have a home. I have a partner who knows me and lets himself be known. I have my mother, still, who calls on Sunday afternoons and asks about my week in ways that always find the real question underneath the polite one. I have a small circle of friends, some old, some new, and I have work I find meaningful, and I have a mirror that no longer feels like an interrogation room. I don't want to pretend that everything is easy now. There are still days when the old shame flickers back on, uninvited, usually triggered by something small, an offhand comment in public, a memory that surfaces without warning. But those days no longer define my life. They visit, they leave, and I know how to sit with them without letting them take up permanent residence. If you have listened this long, I want to leave you with a few things that I would have wanted someone to say to me when I was younger, standing in a hallway looking at my mother clip-on earrings, and not understanding why it mattered so much. First, you are not broken. Whatever you are feeling, however unfamiliar or contradictory it seems, it is information, not evidence of a defect. Sit with it. Ask what it is telling you. You do not have to act on it immediately, and you do not have to explain it to anyone until you are ready. Second, find one person you can be honest with, and if that person is not in your life yet, keep looking because they exist. That first honest conversation, however small, will not solve everything, but it will crack the seal on years of pressure and let a little air in. Third, be careful with the internet. It is full of people ready to hand you a label and a script, and sometimes that label and script will be useful, and sometimes they will be a poor fit that you'll spend years trying to unbelong from. Use the internet as one voice among many, not as the final authority on your own life. Fourth, treat the people who love you as adults who are capable of hearing the truth over time. Do not spring your inner life on them as a confession designed to test their loyalty, and do not withhold it from them forever as a kind of protection they didn't ask for. Find the middle path, the one where you tell people what they need to know when they need to know it, in a way that respects both their limits and yours. Fifth, and finally, be patient with yourself. The version of you that lied to a thrift store cashier at 15 was not a bad person. They were a scared person doing their best with the information they had. The version of you that made mistakes in relationships in your 20s was not a bad partner. They were a person still learning how to be honest. The version of you that hides today is not a coward. They are someone waiting for a safer moment, and they will know that moment when it comes. You do not have to hate any of your previous selves in order to become a better one. In fact, in my experience, the opposite is true. The more gently I have treated the person I used to be, the more clearly I have been able to see who I actually am. I did not tell you this story to make you feel sorry for me, and I did not tell it to inspire you in some tidy way that fits inside a slogan. I told it because when I was younger, I would have given a great deal to hear someone speak about this part of life without either fanfare or apology. Someone who could say, this happened, and this is what I learned, and this is what I am still learning. If any part of my story has helped you understand yourself a little better, or helped you understand someone in your life a little better, then the years it took me to be able to tell it honestly have been worth something beyond my own life. And that idea gives me a quiet kind of joy I did not expect. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.